Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maddie Skowski. I will be one of the moderators today, along with Carrie Weckelo. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, Staying Ahead in the New Reality, Enhancing Your Treasury Function, hosted by Actualize Consulting's Kunle Aladewolu and Bellin's Lena Pennington. It is currently 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, so we will go ahead and get started. Before we do, I just wanted to quickly mention that you are able to ask questions as we go along. Just use the chat feature that you see on your screen. And for those of you interested in CTP credits, we will send out participation confirmation shortly after this webinar. So without further ado, I will introduce our host. Kunle Aladewolu of Actualize Consulting is a highly experienced Treasury consultant advising clients on all aspects of Treasury. He is familiar with all stages of the implementation process and a wide variety of Treasury management systems, including Kyriba, Bellin, and FIS Quantum. He received his Master's of Engineering in Computing and Artificial Intelligence from Imperial College London and his MBA from INSEAD. Lena Pennington of Bellin brings over 8 years experience helping international companies optimize their Treasury system setup in both implementation and sales capacities in North America, Europe, and Asia. She received finance degrees from Fairleigh Dickinson University in Teaneck, New Jersey, and the London School of Business and Finance. So I will go ahead and pass it to you, Lena and Kunle.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Maddie. Yes, welcome everyone from our side as well. Let's have a quick look at the agenda for today. We're going to be looking first at some of the current market trends, what we see treasurers move at the moment. We're going to be looking at what's going on in the economy and how this is impacting cash flow and funding. Next, we're going to be looking at some of the ways we've been adapting to remote treasury, what the remote treasury world looks for us personally, for our teams, for collaboration, communication, and so forth. And finally, we're going to be looking at some additional optimization strategies that you can use at this time to keep you, your team, and your organizations successful, even at this time. Next slide, please, Maddie. So why are we having this webinar? Why are we talking about this? We find ourselves at such a time with so many different things happening on the social front, on the political front, the economic landscape, and all of that has really turned what used to be nice to have into must-haves. On the social front, we've seen communities around us awaken to injustice, and we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement spread globally. Politically, Brexit continues to make headlines. The political division in the US isn't really going anywhere either. And finally, of course, COVID has rocked our economy with unprecedented lockdowns. And so we are all having to take all of these things into account. But as we say, Treasury was born for turbulence. So let's look at some of the ways we can deal with this and how we can stay resilient as we continue to work remotely. Next slide, Maddie. Yeah, thank you. So the first thing that is really important is cash visibility. It's the bread and butter of all cash management, and having real-time reliable data, specifically in crisis times, is so important. And to know where your funds are, what funds are available, knowing what cash is trapped and available is important. Knowing which country it is in, on which accounts, in which currencies, from which banks, is so important to know, and to know that in real time. So when your board reaches out to you to be able to make decisions on where the company is going, you really don't want to spend half a day or a day collating that data manually. And there's really no reason for you to do that anymore. There's enough providers, enough technology out there to really automate this. So this is something that if you've struggled in the past to make that business case to senior management, the crisis should really help you to eliminate that manual task and be able to focus on more of an analysis than data collection. Next slide, please, Maddie.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. I think that's a very good starting point. And what we tend to find as well is a lot of clients start from there on their roadmap to having a more digital treasury. And the next step usually is to take their cash forecasting to the next level. So we find that a lot of treasuries would forecast on their own activities. So treasury payments, treasury deals, but not necessarily group-wide cash forecasting. And what I've found in my experience all through my career is for some reason, group-wide cash forecasting is always on the agenda, but never quite gets done. And it's always sort of the nice to have that every other thing seems more urgent. But obviously with all that's gone on this year and in the past 6 months, particularly, this has come to the forefront of most clients. So what tends to happen is after cash visibility is done, then they're looking to do group-wide cash forecasting as well. And we all know from a business point of view that knowing the things that impact your business is one of the most vital things to keep your business running. And for Treasury, it's also important to know that as is the foundation for being able to project whether you're going to have needs or surpluses from a liquidity point of view. And to make that group wide, you have to sort of start thinking of Treasury as the parent that's looking after the kids, if you like, of the rest of the company. So making sure that everybody puts the input to that forecast and you're actually responsible for that. So when you're looking at your subsidiaries, you're thinking what credit facilities are they drawing on? Are the accounts funded? If they're in cash pools, what's the daily cash position? And being able to get that full picture as quickly as possible is very important. And as Lena said, many of these things are now possible using technology. And so we find that this tends to be the next step. So can you just get to the next slide, please? And how do you do that effectively? So one of the things that I thought about when I was thinking about this slide was the best way to look at it. What I found, at least talking to a few clients, is one of the reasons why it never gets done is a lot of people, both within Treasury and within the local subsidiaries, almost think of it as a crystal ball exercise. So it's almost like they're thinking, oh, you guys want us to predict the future. And they almost feel like they failed even before they started. And the way I like to think about it is, think about it more as a weather forecast. It's not about predicting the exact things, but it's about, if I want to go out today, do I need my sunglasses or do I need an umbrella? Start very simple in that sense, just so that you're able to actually look at what the areas that people might need funding or what areas where you might have surplus. And if you keep it simple and able for people to manage it very easily and easily centralized for HQ as well, I think that's a great place to start. And in terms of how to actually go about doing this, depending on where you are in your journey to digitization, spreadsheets are a good place to start because they're easy to collate, but we would always prefer to use cloud-based platforms. What I'm finding now is a lot of TMSs, treasury management systems, actually allow you to now let your subsidiaries also log in to actually upload their forecast either manually or via their own systems. So I think that's definitely one way to look at this. Yeah, if we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Kunle, there actually a question just came in. How often are you seeing cash forecasts being updated? And the other one is, has the horizon changed in terms of how far out companies are implementing their cash forecasts?
Yeah, those are good questions, actually. I think in terms of the frequency of updates, I think it's getting more and more frequent. So I think in the past, what I used to see with clients a lot was, at least in terms of group-wide forecasting, there would be one sort of yearly forecast, and then it's reviewed monthly. just sort of to say, okay, let's compare actuals with forecasts and see how we're doing, and we review for next month going forward. But in this time, especially in the last 6 months, this has been happening a lot more frequently, because the more frequently you update your forecast, the more accurate they're likely to be. And because obviously with all that's going on, we need to ensure that we know whether we're able to meet our obligations and whether there's enough cash in different parts of the business. It's important to review those forecasts a lot more frequently. And one thing that also helps actually is where your system infrastructure is a bit more mature, and you do have integrations in place with, say, your ERPs, for example. We're finding some clients doing that to actually update forecasts automatically on a daily basis from other systems. And in terms of horizons, I think that's a good one. From what I've seen, I think it varies a bit by industry. But in general, I think companies are looking a bit further out, even within their treasuries. So where before you might have cared more about, just making sure payments are made on time and that money is in the right part of the world, for example, within your different businesses. Now there are even more critical things that businesses are starting to look at, like, can we actually survive in this time? So actually looking out further for cash forecasting, I think, has become a bit more common. But again, it depends on the industry. So some of the industries that have struggled in this time would probably care more about whether they're able to survive in the long run. And it's also become quite common to use scenario analysis on forecasts. So like I said, in especially industries where there's a lot of uncertainty, you might want to look at using some scenario analysis on those forecasts so that you can at least prepare for the worst, if I can put it that way. And that was actually a good one, because it leads us nicely to the next slide.
Yeah, you've mentioned survival there a few times, Kunle, in your answer. And when we look at risk modeling, exposure management for companies, we've seen a shift towards managing liquidity risk, more so than your typical traditional interest rate risk and currency risk. Of course, those are still important to manage, as we have done, but liquidity risk has been really the focus over the last few months, especially by industries that have been hit hard. And there's just no way that you can hedge your revenue, going down the way that COVID has caused for some of the industries to gone down. So really and that's where you need that forecast for, right, is in order to have at least some idea of where you're going. And of course, also here, the local forecasts play an important part, because each country, the restrictions may be different, right? Here in the US, we're still, or at least in my part of the US, in California, the lockdown is relatively strict still, where somewhere in Europe, for example, Germany, is almost back to normal. So having those local subsidiary inputs from across your organization is really important to be able to manage your external funding requirements as well as your internal funding requirements. And it will be interesting how risk will be treated and considered in management discussions, once we've made it through this crisis, because I'm sure that not a lot of companies had a stress testing for what if our revenue goes down entirely, can we survive, right? We didn't really expect those types of scenarios. So risk is something that Treasury can advise senior management on. It's something treasurers know how to deal with. And so knowing the basics, like what you're expecting in terms of cash flow, is really a basis for everything. If we can go to the next slide. One of the other things that has been a focus and where we've seen an increase in attention is also related to risk, but not so much the liquidity risk, but fraud risk. So payment fraud always sees an increase in crisis just because people are distracted. You're moving from an office setup to a home setup. People are fearful, they're insecure, they're not sure what's going on. So that's why fraud prevention has been such an important topic. And what you really need to focus on is having standardized control processes. Why? Because only then do certain requests to do a non-standardized wire from the CFO, who is someone who claims to be the CFO, that would just not go through, because you know what your standards are. So best practice is really to try to centralize how you process payments instead of having different disparate systems. Is pulling that all into one place where you make all of your payments from, no matter which bank you're using. Because with disparate systems, you are just managing different user access, you're managing different processes, perhaps because of the different technical capabilities of these systems. So a drive towards standardization and centralization has definitely picked up speed during this time.
And Lena, we had a question come in.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any new controls you are seeing firms implement due to the remote environment?
Well, there is a definitely a move that, as I mentioned, towards the standardization and centralization. So we've seen clients that even prior to the crisis didn't pay so much attention to the payment side of things, but was more focused on perhaps the cash management or management of financial instruments, that have opted to add payments to their technical setup so that they could centralize things and have one place where they manage the controls, the signers, and the accounts that payments are being made from. In addition, two-factor authentication and single sign-on to whatever systems you're using to process your payments out of has also seen an increase. Were there any other questions? Or Kunle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to add, just I guess on the importance as well of having a standardized and controlled process. So one of my clients recently actually had a fraud attempt where somebody within the finance team was sent a WhatsApp from someone who was supposedly the CEO, asking them to move some funds. So these things happen quite frequently and seem to be happening even more now. Thankfully, the person was able to flag that it wasn't really the CEO, but even if the person wasn't, having a standardized process would probably make sure that that's picked up somewhere along the process before the payment's actually out the door. So I think, yeah, it's a very important thing to bear in mind at this time, especially.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, and we've seen that also within our own organization as well as across our client base. Just a tremendous increase in fraud attempts. Luckily, none of them successful. So if we could move to the next slide, where we'll actually look at one more way that we can use to reduce payment fraud. We mentioned that that centralization and standardization of how you operationally process payments is important. And I think the questions that you need to ask is, where are we making payments from? So what are all the different places where you can enter or upload payments, and how are those being processed? And do we have enough controls across all of these different payment rails, right? And one of the ways that if you are using a centralized payments system is that when you have specifically a multiple ERP system landscape, it's sometimes difficult, again, with disparate systems, to control who has the right to enter beneficiary details for vendors or supplier details, and making sure that those are not are not amended fraudulently, or even if it's if it's a letter you get from your supplier saying that the account details have been updated and it's a legitimate update to the system that an employee has made, having an additional list or screen or filter, if you like, that all of the payments that go out the door will run against to double check whether the beneficiary details are valid. So it just allows you to have that double check across all of your payments to make sure that any amendments are legitimate. In addition, that's just what community and systems allows you to do, is when you can use the data that comes from all of your different ERP systems into one place and have all of that data into one place, it allows you to apply AI algorithms across all of your payments that you make, and for those algorithms to detect statistical outliers, to highlight and flag to you what could be a potentially fraudulent payment. So those are some of the things that are also available to us as treasurers to increase or help prevent fraud.
Yeah, and just to kind of emphasize the point, there's some statistics that's worth sharing that I was talking to Lena about before. So I was reading the ACT's Treasurer magazine here in the UK, and basically it says cyber attacks on financial sector targets surged by a whopping 238% from February to April this year. And somewhere else in the magazine, it also says 60% of financial decision makers in the UK regard payment fraud losses as part of running their business. And for me, I just thought that was a bit alarming because maybe it's because people think it's part and parcel of running their business that the cyber attackers are more encouraged to do more. But the fact that it's more than tripled from February to April this year, it shows that this is definitely something that if you're not already taking very seriously, you probably should. And we're seeing that a lot of clients are taking this more and more seriously, but it's worth sort of highlighting this on your to-do list if you haven't already.
Yeah, very good point. And thank you for sharing those statistics. It definitely shows that how important this topic is. Yeah. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we can move on to the next slide, which we want to highlight the importance of reporting. And I think, no matter the sophistication of your technology setup, every treasurer has their sets of reports in Excel or from the various systems you may be using. But it's just to highlight that data visualization is so important now. The decisions that management needs to make need to be made quickly on reliable data, and it's much easier to digest information if it is visualized. So you want, when you're speaking to your IT, you want any platforms that you're using to be open so they can connect to perhaps already BI tools that your organization is using, so that treasury data can be pushed into those wider reporting systems to support management. And then, of course, your own treasury reporting, no matter which tools you use for that, can include of course, your bank data, data for markets, and other systems like the ERPs for forecasting. So there's really various sources you can use to create your reports and distribute them to whoever needs to see them. One of the questions that treasurers often ask is, what kind of reports are important? Do you have examples of standardized reports? And Kunle, maybe you can share some of the reports that you've seen clients use.
Really ranges depending on where the client is on their journey. But what we tend to see is it usually starts from simple reports around cash position. So once you've got your cash visibility up and running, you can have cash position reports maybe by currency, by market or region, depending on how you're spread out across the globe. Now people are also looking at cash positions by bank. You might want to sort of make sure that you're spreading that out because of counterparty risk as well. We tend to see as well cash balance over time, and all of these sorts of reports you can have on dashboards that is easy for you just to look at every morning. Then people start to look at different other types of reports as well, like the types of payments that they're making, monitoring some of their debt, their credit facilities as well. And then people sort of, when you get a bit more mature, you can start to look at risk analysis as well. Some of the things that we spoke about, FX exposures, you might be tracking your covenants or other types of compliance reporting as well. And I guess maybe slightly closer to the simple side is kind of when you start to compare forecast and actuals as well. So I guess that's another one that we're starting to see a lot of. And for those that get even more complex, we start to see some clients thinking about working capital as well. And all those sorts of reports can actually be put on dashboards in a number of treasury management systems nowadays, or you could actually have your own business intelligence tool outside of the TMS that would allow you to bring data in from all the systems across your organization. So there's a big range there, but it's always better to start simple and then build it up over time.
Yeah, and keep coming back, right? Start by keeping it simple and see what works for your business, because every business has a bit of a different outlook as well, right?
Exactly.
Great, then if there aren't any other questions, we can move on to the next slide. And our next agenda point is some of the ways we can adapt to working remotely in Treasury.
Yeah, thanks. So I think this slide, what I was trying to get at here is just how we can take advantage of technology to work better and collaborate better in this time where people are having to work from home or work from anywhere, really. And I think it's important to think of the icons at the bottom of the cloud as your platform. So I sort of think of that as the foundation. So you use those cloud-based storage platforms as your foundation to make sure that you're using those to store your files and collaborate within your teams, as opposed to more traditional network drives, for example, which would mean you have to be connected to certain VPNs. And I do know that there's some clients where the IT infrastructure means only a certain percentage of employees can actually connect to the VPN at the same time, because they never thought that there would be a time where everybody will be working from home. So things like that would make life a lot more difficult. So they had to basically tell people, log on to VPN to get the files off the network drive, but once you get the files off, log off again so somebody else can go on. But obviously, if you had been set up on some of these cloud-based drives and storage platforms, then you would work a lot easier together. A lot of them work with versioning already. And I think one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up as well is not because people haven't heard of it, but it's because I find that a lot of clients either don't know what's available to them from their IT, or they know but are kind of reluctant to use them. So it's kind of a nudge to say, if you aren't already, start to use these to store your files within your teams. So one client I had, for example, didn't even know that SharePoint was available to them to use as a collaborating tool within their team. And they were still using the network drives, and thankfully it was something that they could then speak to IT about, and they could get set up on there for their team to manage collaboration that way. And then on the top is more about once you have saved all of your files and a lot of your storage is on these cloud-based drives, you can start to think about what tools you want to use to collaborate. So again, this is more kind of a nudge to say, you know, check what is available to you from your IT and make use of it. Teams is a good one that I'm seeing a lot of clients use now, where you can create groups, create teams within teams, create channels within those teams. And it works quite nicely, especially now that everybody's working from home. And you can have a channel within your team group that would allow you to sort of ask specific questions that relate to that channel, but everybody can still see it as well. So I think that's a good way to keep everybody sort of on the same page within your team, but only people who relate to a specific channel would have to do work. So you're not basically flooding people with emails, but everybody is still on the same page. I've seen these work quite nicely. And the last point is just something that we thought to share as well, because kind of with Lena at Bellin and myself at Actualize, we're kind of used to a traveling work lifestyle as consultant. So me, all my career, I've always been a consultant. So I'm kind of used to when I'm thinking of where to save files, when I'm thinking of how I work, I'm always trying to think of the easiest way to be able to access stuff from anywhere. So it's a good mindset to have, I think, to start to think about, as I think this is here to stay. As many companies have said, even after COVID is gone, this would be the new normal for them is a lot of people working from home or working remotely. And the last point I just wanted to add as well, which is kind of a simple point, but you find that it increases productivity quite a lot, is for people to invest in personal hardware. I think, especially now that we know that it's not just going to be a few months and this is something that's going to carry on for a while, is just simple things like, you know, wireless headsets, having an extra monitor, or even a new router would increase your productivity. You don't want to be the person that's always cutting out on the calls, which can be frustrating for you. So yeah, I thought that was worth mentioning. I don't know if there are no questions.
There's one question, Kunle, that came in.
Thanks,
what are some obstacles that you're seeing companies having from really transitioning fully into the remote work space?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think a lot of it is mindset, like I said. So you would find a lot of people who had worked traditionally in a certain environment might find it more difficult to move to this way of working. And another thing I've seen that I guess is particular to Treasury is that a lot of processes are still somewhat paper-based. So I know a lot of clients that still have to fill a bunch of forms for banks, and wet signatures are required. So they will still have to post those out to the banks. So when you are in that sort of setting, it's easy to kind of stick to what has traditionally worked and the traditional ways of doing things in terms of processes. But now that people aren't able to get to the office, people aren't able to open letters or post letters to banks like they were before. I'm seeing more and more banks open to digital signatures, for example, or scans. And I'm hoping that that would at least help all of us going forward and somewhat save the world by saving paper as well. But yeah, I think if I think about it, another thing might be for Treasury anyway, is because we move so much money around the world, you might feel more secure maybe being in your office on your office network. That might be another thing. But I guess now with a lot of these cloud-based platforms, they're all very secure, at least most of them. So it's worth, when you're going through the process of RFP and then finding out what system you want to get, ask them for the certifications that they have and to make sure that they're all safe. But a lot of the big vendors are safe, and whether you're logging in from a cafe or you're logging in from your mobile or from the office, it would be just as safe using some of those systems. I hope that answers the question. But if there's no other question, we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So just another thing to think about in terms of working remotely is, once you have sort of your platforms and your systems and everything in place to make it easy for you guys to collaborate, it's then also to think about processes within the organization. And it's important to standardize as much as possible. Now, this is not something that I expect to happen overnight, especially for those industries where you might have grown by acquisition, for example. So the company that you've acquired might have some old systems that are now different to the current system that all the others are working on. Obviously, it's just important to have a roadmap and make sure that there is a route to them coming on board and being as standard as the other systems that you already have. Like it says on the first one, it was never really something that was acceptable, but now it's almost a critical issue because it makes it more difficult for you to get that real-time data that you need in one place. And another thing that's important is to clearly define and communicate roles and responsibilities. So these processes that you're standardizing across the globe, obviously, if you are not going to be seeing each other or everybody's having to work remotely, it's important for people to actually understand what their role is and what is expected of them. And unfortunately as well, in this time, many people have taken ill or had people ill that they had to take care of. So when you have standardized processes and systems standardized globally, it's easy for people to step in and help out, either within your team or within other teams as well. So I think these are some of the things to think about that would help you if you have easily transferable plans and documentation, for example. It would make it a lot easier for you if you had to adapt to a change.
I just want to add to that, Kunle, tying it back to the point you made earlier about Teams or some of these other communication platforms, is when you start setting up different, let's say, channels where you discuss different treasury topics like cash management or FX management, is to also think about your subsidiaries that have worked from your perspective remote to headquarters for all of their entire work life. And so being able to connect to these remote teams and including them in that conversation, you can actually use this as an opportunity to say, okay, now we're all in the same boat, we're all working remotely, and maybe you can use that to actually increase communication and collaboration across the different team members or different subsidiaries that you have to understand, even if it's forecast, if it's discussing what they're seeing locally and how that impacts cash flow. So just something to think about as we continue working remotely.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. That's a very good point.
And there was a question that came in. It says, besides a VPN, what are other ways to secure mobile or at-home networks?
Yeah, maybe that's something I can speak to. Of course, of course. There's, if you looking at your own home Wi-Fi, you can always discuss with your IT what are some of the measures you can take to, increase security on it, like changing your passwords and things like that. But what I wanted to highlight is, if you're using some of these cloud-based systems that Kunle introduced earlier, or if you're using a cloud-based treasury management system, these are, even if your Wi-Fi was to be hacked, these are secured connections. So somebody that was to hack, even though they might be able to retrieve a local file saved on your laptop, they wouldn't be able to get data out of those secured cloud-based systems. So using those cloud-based systems, again, is an argument that if you've had difficulty convincing your IT teams or your management for these systems, one of the arguments you can make. In addition is a two-factor authentication. So, and single sign-on, which is something that you can also discuss with your IT team. They will probably have that in place already. So if you're using systems that are not integrated into that setup yet, something to look at and to add to increase the security across the systems that you use.
Great, thanks, Lena. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So this was something that I just thought was nice to add, as it went quite nicely with the presentation. So Kerry, our COO, posted this on LinkedIn last week, I believe. And when I saw it, I thought actually it ties in quite nicely with this presentation. And it's a write-up from the Society of Human Resource Management, and it's about working remotely. And I think these tips are exactly what we're trying to say in terms of setting clear expectations and being flexible. I won't go through all of them, but it's worth either reaching out to Kerry on LinkedIn, you see this on her page, or directly on the SHRM website as well. I think the number 1, 5, and 10 are the ones that I kind of wanted to pick out here is to set clear expectations, because that's important. People need to know what they're doing and what is expected of them, especially when they're not sitting right next to you like they used to, and emphasize that communication. So leave your door open, and this works whether you're a manager or whether you're within a team as well, and let people be able to communicate freely and often. And the last one is to celebrate success. So I think that's very important for people to still feel like they're achieving something as part of a team, even if they can't see each other in person. So I guess you can read the others now or later in your spare time, but I think these were what I mentioned, which is why we decided to add these in.
Yeah, I
so
think those are.
Yeah, no, please go ahead, Lena.
Yes, I think those are really good points, Kunle, especially the communication, and sometimes even just if it's not work related, just asking how people are doing. I think the working from home is not easy. It's we all had to adapt. So I think that can also help strengthen team spirit and keep everyone's morale up. So really good points. We can go to the next slide, Maddie. And we just added this to really, to talk about access from anywhere. I think, before COVID, most of us at least had a very nicely separated work life and private life, and all of a sudden we are within each other's kitchens. And so, working from home has definitely presented new challenges, especially for those who have children at home or who have had, elderly at home that they need to take care of, God forbid, sick family members. So one of the things that I've seen clients as well as myself use, if you can't always sit at your laptop, even when you're working from home. So another, what used to be a nice to have is a mobile app, even, across all of these different platforms that Kunle mentioned earlier, as well as, your treasury management systems. Having a mobile app where you can see reports and take different actions has really become a must-have in some cases. And yeah, so I don't know, Kunle, if you want to share some of how the situation has been for you and your family.
It's been as it has been, I guess, for most people who have kids at home as well. So not having them go to nursery with them at home as well over the last 6 months was interesting. I think my wife once said, if somebody said we would have to do this for 6 months with them at home, we would never have thought it was possible. And my daughter probably knows a bit about Treasury now, bearing in mind how many calls she has jumped in on. But it's one of those things where now we sort of see each other more as human beings, as opposed to just work colleagues. And even with clients, you see even clients sort of with their kids in the background, everybody's a bit more human. And like you say, having all of these ways of working from anywhere and having mobile apps and being able to just carry your laptop and carry on working, especially now as kids are kind of going back to school, but we still can't go to work. For some schools, they've had to stagger the start and end times for the kids as well. So you might find yourself having to pick up your kids earlier than you did before. Just being able to be flexible and to be able to do all these things on your phone if required, I think is now a must, not so much a nice to have anymore. So like you said, Lena, even some TMSs now come with mobile apps. So you might be on a school run and somebody sends you an urgent payment to approve, and you can actually approve that on your phone. Things like that are now kind of a necessity.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting across so many different aspects how this new reality has really brought about new challenges, and all of a sudden, your whole perspective has changed. So hopefully there's a bit of a silver lining in that we all come to work as complete humans with all of our dogs and whatever we have at home, right? Good, great. Well, maybe we can go to the next slide then. And this is taking us to our final agenda point for the day. Maddie, if we can move to the next slide, please.
We had one question. It says,
Oh.
what changes do you see clients making to adapt to remote treasury? And is there anything more you would wish to see more of?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, for all of those treasury teams really that they've had the chance to implement cloud-based systems, even for their, you know, for their file management or for their treasury management, have really had a leg up, because they didn't matter where they worked from, for that aspect at least. So the changes that we've seen has really been mainly on the mindset front, and also kind of working with banks, and how banks have, you know, become more open to take in, as Kunle mentioned earlier, digital signatures instead of wet signatures. You know, sometimes you need signatures from 3 different people on the same document, and you can't send that around via the post, right? That will take weeks. So that's kind of some of the adaptations that we've seen to Treasury, right? That's really been impacted by the banks that Treasury just works with a lot. And I think some of the things that we've seen and that we'd like to see more of is an increase of communication and perhaps also collaboration across different departments. So, you know, you hit the crisis mode and everybody is, you know, is like, oh, what's going on with our organization? And so an increased communication from the top to keep people feel secure about what's going on and informed. Within your teams, having better communication, and then also working across departments, for example, on cost reduction strategies, right? Or capital, working capital management is what can we do as teams now, not working in silos anymore, but working together to get through this crisis. So we're hoping that that's going to last, and would like to see even more of. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add, Kunle, if we have any additional questions.
No, that was well said. I think the only thing actually, if I was to add something, is I think what would be even better to see as well now is a lot of that communication was a lot more when the lockdown started, and I think now that things are kind of calming down more, maybe people are starting to communicate a bit less, but it's important to keep that going, because now we're seeing that Treasury is more and more a strategic partner within businesses. And so if you keep that communication going both within your team and with other parts of the business, it would become something that's that grows more and more even after all of this is over. So it wouldn't just be a sort of crisis solution, but something that's the new normal indeed for Treasury and the businesses going forward.
Right, yeah, I agree, Kunle. Super good. Then we can go to the final agenda point and looking at some of the other optimization strategies that Treasury can look at this time. And one of the ways we mentioned that we've seen different departments starting to work together more to see how they can reduce costs and help get their companies through this crisis. And one of the ways we've seen, what we've seen Treasury teams pick up is global multilateral netting. So for those who may be unfamiliar with the concept, what this does, it's really focused on intercompany invoicing. So where your different subsidiaries are invoicing each other, and without any netting, what happens is that you have bilateral payments and perhaps in different currencies, and you constantly have money moving around the organization, which is inefficient and costs a lot of bank fees. So what netting does, it usually takes the Treasury team as the netting center, and it takes all of the invoices that may be issued during a certain period or due in a certain period, usually monthly. And instead of paying them all as they become due, you pick one date during the month when those payments are made. And it's just one payment that is either made to a net owing company or a net receiving company, or a payment that is made from a net owing company to the netting center. And so what this does, it can really save a lot of time on the reconciliation of these intercompany invoices, as well as save bank fees. So we've seen clients save over $1 million annually on just implementing this. And it's really just an implementation on the process of how you handle these intercompany invoices, right? It's not a certain product or service from a bank. It's really something you can do internally, but it does require pulling in accounting, IT, sometimes tax, and Treasury to be able to get this implemented across the organization. So, but something very powerful to consider. I don't know, Kunle, if you have, I think you've implemented netting with an organization before. I don't know if you want to share any of your experience on that.
Yeah, I think it's something that's definitely useful, especially in this time. As Lena said, it will save you a lot of time and effort as well. The client that I implemented this at was actually present in 70 countries. So we had to implement this across 70 different countries within different departments as well. So like Lena said, it's important to build the right team, first of all, to be able to implement this properly. So we had the right SMEs and the right stakeholders, both within Treasury, the wider finance community, and all the other departments as well. So it was something that for them, us within the internal team had to go out and get buy-in from all the different markets and all the different CFOs, because the way the company was set up was, or is, that they have a CFO for each market. So we had to get the buy-in from the CFO and also appoint what we called intercompany champions in those different markets. But it was a very successful implementation. It took a bit of time because, and again, the thing about netting is the more entities you have on, the more the benefits for the whole organization, because you don't want people to be doing two separate processes. So we basically had to launch it as a big bang, which is what we called it, because of my fondness for Sheldon Cooper. But it was something that we basically had to launch across all 70 countries at the same time, but the benefits came in right from the get-go. So the moment we went live, just even being able to say to the CFO of the whole organization that in this month, this is the amount of intercompany that there is within your organization. That was something that they didn't know. Because I remember when we started the project and we were asking people, you know, what are some of the volumes and values of this intercompany stuff within the company, and nobody knew. And just having access to that data, obviously we're not even talking about all the other things like saving bank fees and saving time and helping with disputes internally as well, everything now recorded within one system. I think this is definitely one process that I think is worth exploring if you haven't already within your organization, especially if you do have a lot of intercompany invoicing going on.
Yeah, there's lots of powerful or you know, stories behind these implementations as they involve so many teams, but usually really great stories. So that's great. Then we can move on to the next slide to just look at some final optimization strategies as we pull up towards the hour. One of the, I'll start with in-house banking just because it relates to the intercompany netting. And I think that's something we've also seen is, you know, because global multilateral netting puts Treasury as the netting center, it allows you to connect to all of the different subsidiaries in your group. And what that allows you to do is then really to have a platform to establish other in-house banking services, which again save bank fees. And so, for example, intercompany funding, instead of having your subsidiaries go out to different banks to get that funding, intercompany FX, so that you can trade on gross basis at central level. And those are just all some measures you can look at to save additional bank fees, to reduce costs during this crisis for your company. The other optimization or the other aspect that we've seen companies focus on is payments. And here specifically in the US, I think it's still around 60% of business-to-business payments are still being made via paper check. Now, people aren't in businesses anymore where these checks are being sent to or have to be collected from. So we've seen a move to digital payments, and that's something that you may want to look at as well. Digital payments are a lot cheaper to make, so perhaps this is again a time of opportunity for you to get your suppliers or your business partners onboarded to say we're moving from paper checks to digital payments. Yeah, and so then, as well, of course, standardization and centralization, which we've discussed, moving away from having to use different e-banking platforms, because a lot of times if you have issues with them, maybe the bank is in a different country and speaks a different language, and maybe that country is differently affected by COVID and has different working hours at the bank. And if you have an issue with something, with a token to access that platform, it's really, again, a lot more effective and efficient using a centralized platform.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. And just the other 2 points that we've seen people doing, or that is worth considering in optimizing your treasury even further. The first is around integration and automation. So we already spoke a bit about integration of systems like ERPs and other types of systems with your treasury management system to make things easier and smoother. But another one that's worth mentioning is automation of repetitive processes using RPA and other automation tools. So I think I mentioned this recently, that my very first job over a decade ago, I was actually building an automation tool, which wasn't very good at the time, but over time now, these things have become so much better. And very recently, we've actually been looking into using RPA for some clients, for example. So you could actually look into how to automate some of your repetitive processes that are simple enough, that might take you hours to do, but take a robot a few minutes. And that will save you a lot of time and effort that you can then spend on more value-adding tasks for you and for your team as well. And the other thing is bank account rationalization. I think this sometimes is easier said than done. Again, like I said before, around when you have acquisitions and you've grown by acquisitions, and maybe the new teams that join have a different way of doing things. But what we tend to see is over time, some treasury teams or just companies in general within the whole organization would build up a whole load of bank accounts and relationships with many different banks. And it's worth thinking about how you can rationalize that, review your current landscape, think about whether you need all the banks that you have, whether you need all the bank accounts that you have, because the fewer accounts you have, the easier it is for you to manage and maintain them. And even when you start doing projects like we spoke about, starting with cash visibility and some payment optimization as well, you'll find that if you only have a few banks to deal with, it would make the process and the project go through a lot smoother as well. So I think that was all that we wanted to get through. I don't know if there are any final questions.
So I'm not seeing any questions, so I guess we can go ahead and close because we're pulling right up on the hour. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Lena and Kunle for leading the discussion. If you have enjoyed the webinar today, I highly encourage you to connect with Lena and Kunle on LinkedIn. And as I mentioned before, for those of you in need of CTP credits, we will send out your confirmation of attendance shortly after this webinar ends. And we will also send out a recording of this presentation once it is live on our website. So I hope you all have a great week, and thank you again to Lena and Kunle.
Thanks,
Thank you
Maddie.
so much.
Thank you all for joining.
Bye-bye.